real pleasure to be here tonight and thinking about environmental things. I think Gary set the bar too low. It is only, at least as interesting and challenging, whatever, as the debates later, then I don't think we've done very well. I think we're going to exceed that bar by miles. But one of the things that will, of course, be very interesting is, do these issues, environmental challenges, climate, etc., feature at all in the debate that we will be seeing maybe on catch-up later tonight. So I'm going to move on to introduce Ian. Ian is a professor at, now mine's gone blank, St Andrews, yes, St Andrews University, both before and after his time at Defra. And I think actually you continued actually to combine that, because one of the things that's really interesting is in the post of Chief Scientific Advisor is a way of bringing very eminent scientists into government, but actually quite a lot of them combine the role with an academic thing to basically be able to bridge both those camps. And they play an absolutely critical role within government of linking government into cutting edge academic thinking, the wider research and knowledge base, etc., bring that in, challenging in government, but also making sure, I think, that their colleagues back in academia really understand some of the practicalities of being in government and why maybe sometimes science advice alone does not determine policy outcomes. And when you talk about science advice in government, I always think that's a very interesting thing. Ian held down the job of chief scientist in Defra for 7 years, which is, I think, quite a notable achievement, and is going to talk today about responding to environmental challenges. So obviously, his brief at Defra went well across the agenda of Defra, beyond environment, into such difficult issues as animal health, badgers. Many Defra ministers struggled with badgers. Many Defra chief scientific advisors struggle with badgers and things like that. So what we're going to do is, Ian's got a lecture. He's going to talk for 45 minutes or so. Do tweet, do share photographs, as Gary said, on social media. But then we're very keen to hear from you. So this is your opportunity for questions. And hello, people watching on the live stream. Adam in the front row is there to pick up your tweets, hashtag Burntwood19. So if you want to ask a question, Adam will then decide whether it's interesting or not. And if you overcome that sort of interesting hurdle, Adam is going to gesture and we will enable you to ask questions as well. So you don't have to be here to ask questions. So I am going to go and sit in the front row so I can see Ian's slides and also keep him to time to make sure we've got enough time for questions as well, which Ian has asked me to do. So without further ado, can you welcome your guest lecturer tonight, Sir Ian Boyd.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much for that introduction, Jill, and also to Gary for the invitation to come and speak to you this evening. When Gary asked me to speak, I went through this sort of private debate about, well, what am I going to say? Because as Jill has said, I sat at the confluence, if you like, between government and science, and that in itself is an interesting subject. But it can get quite dry at times, and there were other more salacious things that kind of went on within Defra, and Jill has mentioned also the issues around badger culling, but I could talk about the chemistry of plastic bags, or I could talk about neonicotinoid pesticides, the whole pesticides issue, the whole farming issue, what should we be doing with the countryside, and even Salisbury, because I was partly responsible for the cleanup of Salisbury. So there are lots and lots of interesting things one could talk about. However, if I was to really push myself into the space of saying, well, what is really, really important, and what were the big kind of lessons I got from sitting inside government? It's about global change. It's about people on the planet, quite frankly. And that's kind of what I want to speak about tonight. It's the kind of integrated lessons that I got from sitting in a slightly kind of taking a helicopter view of the world, seeing a whole load of streams of information coming in, some of which initially were just very confusing and trying to integrate them into a wider message. One can drill down into each one of those, and of course there's a tremendous amount of interest in each one of those messages. But what I'd like to try to do is give you a high level view that which is something I have sort of built up during my time in Defra. So thank you for the opportunity to do this. And this is about environmental challenges, and that's the reason for the title. How do we respond to environmental challenges? And I will start by saying one thing, that I think environmental challenges are something much, much bigger than simply climate change. I say simply climate change, that's difficult enough in itself. Climate change is a symptom of a wider systemic problem that we have. And what I'd like to try to do is explain how I see that systemic problem and potentially some of the solutions that there might be in place. I will also say that I'll caveat my remarks initially by saying that I think the report that the Committee on Climate Change produced recently on net zero was an excellent report. I think if anybody here hasn't read it, I would read it, and read it to the extent between the lines, because what it's saying is actually there are some real challenges there. It's saying that the challenges are something we can step up to, but it is saying that we need to ramp up the policy response very significantly from where it is at the moment. Did I see efforts like that in government? Well, probably not. So we need significant change into the future in terms of how government is actually responding to these sorts of things. And we also need to ramp up our technical side, which is about carbon reduction technologies. And also we need to make sure we don't just export our carbon impacts. But I'm saying that at the beginning because nothing that I'm going to say further down the line in this talk is meant to undermine anything we're doing in trying to meet net zero. It may sound like that sometimes, but it is not meant to be like that. We are slightly delusional, I think, about what we need to do with respect to meeting the climate challenges. And I think that if I was to pick an idea from Socrates, it's the idea of eudaimonia. And eudaimonia, in his view, was the pathway to happiness. And I think that we are all trying to find our pathways to happiness. Now, if we all do that individually, I think that we will end up in a pretty unhappy and catastrophic place. What we do need to do is have a collective optimization across that pathway and understand at the end of the day what happiness is. And one of the messages I want to give is that it's not GDP growth. It's got to be something different from that. Some of you may say, but we already know all this. And I say, well, actually, we may say these sorts of things, but actually doing the things that are required in order to be able to make real shifts in policy and shifts in people's behaviours is something quite different. And I don't think generally we're very grounded about that. I would also say that even a lot of forward-thinking economists don't quite get this right. And people like Joe Stiglitz, for example, is quite dismissive about demonizing the Malthusian hypothesis. I have to say, I've spent a lot of time in natural science working with natural populations, and the Malthusian ideas are pretty active there. And I think that we cannot think that we are beyond some of the consequences of the Malthusian ideas. And if the longer we put off responding to some of the signals that we get, the more likely that ugly Malthusian moment is going to be, and the deeper it will be, the bigger problem it will be when it actually comes up. So what I'd like to do, if I can get this right, so that was the title slide, but so what I'd like to do through this talk is three things, basically. I want to try and define where I think the main problem sits. And I've already said I don't think it's climate change. I think that there are some deeper problems sitting there. I'd like to then have a go, and it's my personal go, at trying to understand the political, social, and cultural reactions to that. So this is more of me trying to be a social scientist and stepping back from the problem and saying, well, actually, how do we understand our reactions to it? And then I want to spend a bit of time trying to look at some solutions. So let's have a look at defining the problem. Well, in my view, the problem is summed up in this diagram. It's a bit complicated, but nevertheless, I think it does sum up where we are. This is a compendium of information about material extraction from the UNEP International Resource Panel, a body which has been working away for many years, producing some wonderful reports, and I really would recommend that you look at the work that the International Resource Panel has done. And what these show is the material consumption, the timeline of material consumption across the globe. The two diagrams are domestic extraction on your left and physical trade on your right. The composition of these is slightly different. But the diagrams show that over the last 50 years, there's been a continuous increase. It's actually really an exponential increase in material consumption with no suggestion of any let-up. And that's for all commodities. It's for biomass, fossil fuels, metallic ores, non-metallic minerals. That is actually quite worrying, considering what we've been trying to do over the last couple of decades in terms of trying to control our environmental impacts. That actually since the turn of the millennium, if anything, there's been an uptick in the amount of resource that we have extracted. And what I want to do is illustrate some of the consequences of this through the next few slides. And I'll start by just talking a little bit about something that is a very common commodity, and that's sand. Some of you may think that the world is full of sand, but actually it's becoming a scarce commodity. There are a lot of reasons why it's becoming a scarce commodity, but mainly because sand is a significant component of cement and concrete. And I think Vaclav Smil, who's the Canadian environmental scientist, has suggested that cement is perhaps a sensitive indicator of economic development consumption. And I think he's probably right about that. And if you look at the consumption of cement and the consumption of sand, then it's probably telling us something about our rates of consumption. But basically, just to give you a scale of this, the US Geological Survey estimated that the US used about 4.4 gigatons of cement during the whole of the 20th century. China used 6.4 gigatons in the 3 years between 2011 and 2013. So in those 3 years, China used 1.5 times the amount of cement that the US did in the whole of the 20th century. That gives you an idea of that uptick, the exponential uptick in resource consumption. And remember, there is no let-up in that. It is going on and on and on. And of course, sand is being used for that purpose. And the reasons why sand is becoming scarce is that quality matters. You can't just use any sand for building. It's got to be a certain type of sand. There's a lot of illegal extraction going on, but there's also a high cost of transport associated with sand in that it's got to be sourced relatively locally. So unlike sort of high value metals, we're not trading them all over the world, not trading sand all over the world. So sand is actually becoming scarce, despite the fact that there is a lot of it in the world. It's economically, practically becoming scarce. And that gives you an idea that just because something appears to be very abundant doesn't mean to say that we can access it in the ways that we want to all of the time. But it's also suggesting that we're approaching limits. Now, you could say that that curve that I showed you doesn't matter. And I hear this from some economists. It doesn't really matter too much because actually we're getting nowhere near the limits of resources, of the planetary resources. It could go on and on. It could be thousands of times bigger than it is at the moment, and we could get away with that. And certainly with something like sand or something like iron, for example, the planet's, a lot of it's made of iron. Aluminium is the same. There's lots of it around. The question is it accessible? And so there is evidence that we're approaching some of our limits. Here is just a kind of slightly ad hoc selection of pieces of information suggesting that we're approaching limits. And of course, some of you will remember the Limits to Growth book that was published in 1972. I remember reading it as a student, actually, and being pretty impressed by it. And it has had a pretty rough ride since, because it predicted peak consumption of certain types of commodities, certain metals and minerals, which apparently has not come about. So, you know, some economists will turn to Limits to Growth and say its predictions have not been borne out. However, I would say that if you look at the actual availability of materials, I think a lot of its predictions have actually been borne out. Now, here's some examples. Global fish stocks are fully exploited. I would have said, and this does go to some of my academic background, that they're probably overexploited, probably by as much as 50%. So it's not just fully exploited, they're probably overexploited. Global energy needs for mining are going to go up because of the problem of accessing materials. And some suggestions say that by 2050, between 21 and 37% of our global energy consumption will just be used mining our basic materials. The energy return on investment in oil, that's how many barrels of oil it takes to get a barrel out. So we get about 50 barrels. We used to get about 50 barrels for every barrel used to get out in 1940. We're now down to 15 to 1. In some types of oil production, like tar sands in North America, it's down to 4 or 5 to 1. Once it gets to 1 to 1, it's not worth taking it out. And so we're gradually moving in this direction where it's taking more and more energy to access the energy source that we're needing. Slightly more complex, land use for agriculture has peaked. Now, there are lots of reasons for that, and we continue to intensify the use of agriculture, but we intensify it by essentially mining minerals elsewhere in order to be able to sustain agriculture. So fundamentally, we are actually, in some senses, we can only obtain materials by either growing them or mining them. Actually, even when we grow them, it's a mining process because we're actually using a lot of basic minerals in that process for fertilizers and that sort of thing. Fertilizer use is increasing at about 5% per annum, which is much higher than the rate of increase in agricultural production. So we're on a treadmill here. We're actually using more and more resources in order to get the kind of levels of agricultural production we need. This is a kind of compendium of some of the indicators that we're approaching limits, and there are a lot of other ones around that I could go through. Let's have a look at material productivity. In other words, what do we get from the materials that we obtain? And what this diagram shows is that actually we're getting pretty good at getting more and more out of the greenhouse gas production that we use. So for every ton of CO2 we produce, we're actually getting higher productivity, which is the grey line there. For energy production, the story is much the same, and also for labor productivity. But for materials that we actually extract from the planet, we're actually getting worse. We're getting more profligate. We're losing productivity. And you can see that in our everyday lives, you know, disposable plastics, all those sorts of things, where we have a disposable culture. So we're pulling materials into the economy, we're using them very quickly and chucking them out again, which is potentially a problem. So let's look at an example from the UK. I've been talking sort of globally up till now. This shows the tons of material used per 1,000 tons gross value added value by sector of the economy. There's perhaps something not too surprising about this. There are some areas where, like services, where the actual material use of services is relatively small, whereas material use of manufacturing is relatively high. However, the red arrow is pointing to agriculture, forestry, and fishing, which is mainly agriculture, actually. Agriculture, and I don't think the UK, by the way, is any different to anywhere else here. Agriculture is incredibly inefficient as a sector relative to many other parts of the economy. It's using resources up at a very high rate. And there are reasons for that. The two main reasons are fertilizers, which take an immense amount of energy to produce, and also livestock production, which is highly inefficient in terms of its material use and energy use. There are other reasons as well. But if you just compare that with something like transport and communications or construction, which are in the middle of the diagram here, you would think that agriculture should be kind of equivalent to them. And it's kind of setting up the idea that agriculture actually, unlike many of these other industrial sectors, has never really transformed itself. We're using fundamentally quite an old set of technologies to grow our food. We till the land, we sow the seed, and we reap we reap the crops. There's not much different in that, whereas in a lot of the other sectors, we've had significant transformation. So we do need transformation in agriculture, and a question is how do we achieve that? Just following through on the theme of agriculture, because it's one of the areas that I feel I know most about. Over the years, and you were going all the way through from 1965 to 2014 here, in these blocks of colour for different types of commodity products from agriculture: wheat, rice, maize, soya, sugarcane. What that is telling us is overall that this is the annual growth rate, by the way, of agricultural productivity, is that over time, our annual growth rate of agricultural productivity is declining. So despite the fact we're putting more and more into it, we're getting less and less back from it. And this diagram, this part of the diagram here, is showing that actually not only are we putting more and more in and getting less and less back, we're doing more and more research, and the research is not coming up with the innovations we need in order to be able to make advances. So there's something wrong sitting at the center of this, in that we're not really hitting the sweet spot with respect to trying to move agriculture on. And I think it's much the same in many other parts of the economy. I wanted to try and sum this up in terms of what I call economics in a single slide, where essentially what we have here is the economy, a box. The economy pulls materials into it. Essentially, materials power the economy, and waste comes out the other end of it. Basically, the diagram I showed at the beginning showing increasing resource consumption has to be followed by increasing waste in an equilibrium system. So everything that goes in, at the end of the day, must come out. It may take a long time to come out, or it may take a short time to come out, but it must come out. So that increasing curve of consumption will be followed by an increasing curve of waste. Now, that waste is in all sorts of different forms. It can be physical waste that we put into landfill or we burn, or it can be gaseous waste in terms of emissions, carbon dioxide, those sorts of things. But nevertheless, it's waste and it comes out. And an important point is that we're dealing with increasing entropy here, and I'll just come back to that in a minute. But fundamentally, waste is coupled to consumption. So this is why I'm saying that, yes, we ought to be going for net zero CO2 if we possibly can. But I said on the BBC not so long ago that we mustn't make it look like we're just putting a bung in the tailpipe of the car without redesigning the car. And that's what we will be doing is if all we do is to shut this off, try and shut this off, try and keep stuff in here. The economy can get bigger, but it kind of get bigger at the rate that it actually absorbs all the materials that come in from the far end, from this end. Almost certainly not. The whole idea of the circular economy is a great idea, but it's not going to grow at the rate that turns this into zero by any means. And you're dealing with increased entropy, and basically it's the laws of physics. It's the second law of thermodynamics. What goes in has to come out. And what's more, when it does come out, it comes out in a more disordered state. So, fundamentally, we are fighting against the second law of thermodynamics all of the time. The question is how can we slow down this process of increasing entropy from high order, which we find with all the minerals, all the resources that we use, sitting in various different parts of the planet, to extracting them and turning them into a more disordered state, much of it actually up in the atmosphere as carbon dioxide or methane or some other product. So there's a question here is, can we decouple economic growth from resource consumption in order to slow this process of disaggregation down? That's an open question, but we need to try to do that as much as possible. There are some drivers behind this. There are some obvious drivers. Population growth, it's increasing demand. There's no doubt about that. But nevertheless, world population is predicted to, the growth is predicted to slow down. It's supposed to come to a peak, sometime, not far from now, actually. And it should start to, the rate of increase should start to slow down from now on. But nevertheless, the idea of having 10.9 billion people by 2100, with all their additional resource consumption and all the additional waste that there is, and all the additional expectations there are, and I'll come back to the expectations in a minute, is a pretty big challenge. But there's a second issue that's driving this, and that's the nature of wealth. Now, this is perhaps a slightly difficult concept. It's something that I certainly think is an important problem. Money is essentially the currency of wealth. I can do Gary a service, and Gary can give me £1 for that service. Now, there's been virtually no material consumption as a result of me getting that £1, but I can go and spend that £1 on material resources if I want. I can accumulate enough money to buy an iPhone, which contains rare earth metals, gold, all those sorts of things. And one of the problems I think that we have is that we are growing the service economy really rapidly, and there's total transferability of that wealth into resource consumption. So that is what is driving the resource consumption curve up in addition to population growth. It's the structure of the economy that is part of the problem. So what are our constraints? Well, I'm going to come back to this in a minute, but this is actually a diagram that Adair Turner produced about 20 years ago. And it expresses in a nutshell the kind of geopolitical tensions that are going to are already in place, because what it's got on the x-axis is population, on the y-axis it's global hectares per person, and the blue dashed line is the idealized number of global hectares per person that we should have. And it's pretty obvious that there are significant parts of the global population that are under-resourced, and there are significant parts that have much more access to resource than perhaps they should have. I don't think there is any problem about wanting to increase the resource available to those people who have less. The problem is that in order for that to happen, we actually have to reduce the accessibility of the wealthy to what I would call the global commons. So this is going to be a recurring problem, and it's one reason why these international negotiations on climate and potentially on resource consumption become very difficult, and why I think in the G7 we're not very keen on some of the kind of solutions that are being proposed by developing nations. So how does this play out in the political, social, and cultural sphere? Well, what I'd like to do is try to explain to you the way I see this, and this is purely my interpretation. And it's that there are three types of social discourse going on at the moment. Actually, there's a fourth one, which is the denial discourse, but I'm not even going to talk about that because I just don't think it's worth spending too much time on it. It's not that it's unimportant, because politically it can be important. But I think there are three types of social discourse going on about how to grip this problem and deal with it. One I call the tragedy discourse, and when I say tragedy, I mean tragedy as in tragedy of the commons discourse, although it may be a tragedy at the end of the day, we'll need to see. The next one is what I call an adaptation discourse, and finally something I've called a survivalist discourse, which I'll expand on in a minute. And I think there is one of the problems that we have socially is there's a lack of consensus about how to respond with appropriate ambition to these different discourses, because actually they're all competing with each other to some extent. Now, some of you might want to debate this afterwards, but I thought I'd put it up as a way of trying to articulate the problem. So let's have a look, let's unpack these a bit. Let's have a look at the tragedy discourse. Well, the tragedy discourse is built around the idea that there's global environmental assessments have happened, the IPCC has reported, IPBES has reported, there's a global oceans assessment, all of which are saying we have problems, we need to respond to these from a policy perspective. The characteristics of the discourse mainly are that there is exceedance of planetary boundaries. We need to move to a position where we have equality of access to the global commons, and we need to be able to have a fairer way of pricing in global environmental impacts or impacts on the environmental commons. In general, the solutions that are advocated are that, as I've already said, we need to price in the environmental impacts to make sure that net damage is avoided if we possibly can, and that should be in traded goods, services, and infrastructure as well. But it also suggests that we need a redistribution of wealth. So we are, I think probably everybody in this room is in the wealthy category. We have built our wealth around historical exploitation of the global commons. There's a lot of people in the world who have not had that advantage. And this discourse is suggesting that we actually redistribute our wealth across more evenly across the global commons. So it's something about making sure there's less disparity between those who have and those who have not. Its challenges, its failures, failure is too strong a word, but the equality of access to resources at levels currently enjoyed by wealthy nations is probably impossible. So that's the reason for the Adair-Turner downtick. We need to consume a lot less than we do. Global environmental assessments tend, you might want to challenge this, I think they tend to be self-reinforcing products of the discourse that they support, which is a bit of a problem when convincing other people in other discourses, and particularly those who are in the denial camp, that these things are telling them something that they need to know about. And we need to, I think we're tackling that, but we do need to keep it in mind. And it's also undermined by high discounting. So it's undermined by the idea that people are very reluctant to pay a price now when the benefits from that are not until a very long time down the road, and they may not see any of the benefits at all. So it's quite a difficult discourse to put into practice. Let's look at the adaptation discourse. Well, this is built around the idea that technology will come to the rescue. So, and it's built on the idea that, or that the characteristics of it are that we have decentralized economies that will adapt to market forces. We invest in research and innovation to try and find solutions. Obviously, as a scientist, I think that's a great idea. We support it's supported by contemporary economic thinking. So if you speak to economists, this is the kind of discourse that they tend to produce. The law of supply and demand will cut in, and we will adapt in time to make the changes that will save us from environmental catastrophe or whatever we might like to think about it. It's also quite dominant, I think, within governments, within philanthropy and ethical investment. It has an advantage also in that I think it's relatively insensitive to the level of bias that might exist, and I say might exist, within global environmental assessments like IPCC at best and these sorts of things. And it's a no regrets response. You know, why wouldn't you invest in technologies to allow us to adapt? You know, I think it is a no regrets response. Its solutions are about markets. It's about supply demand, as I said. It's about supporting free trade. And that includes things like environmental offsets, those sorts of things that I think we're all probably familiar with. Its failures are probably optimism bias. In other words, can we guarantee that we're going to be able to make those transitions? Can we guarantee that we're going to come up with the technologies to make this happen? Economists will say, well, we've done it in the past, so we'll do it again in the future. But I'll say in a little while why I think that actually might be difficult. Well, actually, I'll say now. I think there is some evidence of declines in levels of innovation. So there's some evidence in the US in particular that despite the fact there's an increasing investment in R&D, the levels of innovation are actually in decline. And I showed it to some extent with agricultural investments in R&D. It's also a response that's very passive. It's sort of, let's wait and see. We'll see what happens, but we'll invest in technologies and we'll solve the problem when we're faced with it. And in my view, that verges on the reckless. So we have a few problems with the adaptation discourse. So if we then move to the survivalist discourse, slightly unkindly, or perhaps cynically, I could call this the winner takes all discourse. It's about really sustaining the status quo with some bells and whistles on it. And it's built around the idea that we can have sustainable development, great idea. And it helps, it's the idea that we can help developing countries to pull themselves up to the level of development that we have in this country. But it sustains the current asymmetries of wealth and power. It's the sort of thing the G7 loves, because actually we're the G7, but we're not going to give up our wealth and power, are we? But we'll help you, but we're not going to give up our wealth and power. It also suggests that R&D investments are not about adaptation, but more about sustaining economic power and competitiveness. And I hear, about in the UK, I hear the rationale for our research investments being both of those things. But if there's a louder voice, it's about, well, we've got to invest in research because we've got to maintain our competitiveness. So the solutions are about sustainable development goals. That's why I've put these up here, which are great, but they have problems. There's lots of trade-offs sitting in here, which are kind of underneath the surface. If you look at some of these sustainable development goals, particularly the social ones, and then you look at the environmental ones alongside, you think, which are going to take priority? Because there's a trade-off there. And I'll bet the social ones take priority over the environmental ones most of the time. And those are only just now beginning to come to the surface. Development banks use this kind of scenario. It tends to support asymmetric trade and the research investments in the way that I suggested. Its failures are that its benefits are shared asymmetrically. It's kind of business as usual. It's got sort of hedonistic overtones. It's jam tomorrow sort of idea. And it doesn't acknowledge that the rates of resource consumption enjoyed by the rich can't be sustained and given to everybody in the world. And it sustains that inequality of access to resources. So what we have, in my view, is these three discourses going on at the moment. And I think I'll just say personally, I can identify with all of them to some extent. And we will all have different weightings between these three discourses. I think the tragedy discourse is very much supported by the NGOs, the activist public, obviously by illustrated here. I think it's generally in the field of left-leaning politics, and it acknowledges the environmental limits that we have. Survivalist mainstream governments certainly are aligned with this kind of view. I mentioned G7 already, maybe right-leaning politics, maybe. The environmental limits are not acknowledged under that discourse. Similarly, under the technology revolution discourse or the adaptations discourse, those environmental limits aren't acknowledged. I think this might be more liberal politics. I don't know. But I'm talking about sort of spheres of influence here more than anything else. We scientists and economists sort of love this sort of idea because it's more for us to do, gives us more responsibility. So let's have a look at solutions. I've tried to set out where I think the problem sits and how the social response is being structured. So what are the solutions? Well, I'm not the only person talking about this by a long way, and I don't really have very clear solutions. There are a number of very eminent people have written about this, particularly economists. And what I would call is this is the economics of sharing, basically, is what they're really pushing for. But in all of these cases, they do fail to acknowledge that there are environmental limits. There is an assumption that we can go on consuming and consuming at the current rates we are. And I don't think that is the case. They also kind of forget, and this is something that is very clear in my mind, having spent time in government, they kind of forget the increasing friction around change that's going on. And I've put this is in, I think it was Nature or Science, just a few weeks ago. Just to illustrate that there's, whatever you do, there's an immense amount of friction in the system that actually counts against that and makes it difficult to implement. So there are other people thinking about this, but I'm not sure that these add up to really robust solutions. And what's more, they do, in order to implement this, they require a total change of public attitude to what the environment gives them and what their expectations are. So I'd just like to break this down into where I think the key issues are that we need to poke the policy wand, if you know what I mean. And I think there are two major trade-offs here. I've mentioned the first one here, the increasing resource consumption against emissions reduction. And that's why I think that when we're talking about net zero carbon, we ought to be seeing that within the total system that we're trying to manage, not just getting to net zero carbon, because I think if we try and do that, we might well get to 2050 and we might well get to net zero carbon, but we'll just have moved the problem somewhere else. And it will be just as ugly, and it'll be in fact, it'll be more difficult to manage. So unless we see it as a total systems problem, we're going to have, so that's the first sort of policy wand, is to make sure that when we're talking about net zero, we know what we're talking about. It's not just net zero, it's about actually reducing resource consumption at the same time. It's a demand side issue as well as a supply side issue. And then there's another trade-off, which is food production versus biodiversity loss. What I'll do is, actually, I'll just go back to the resource consumption emissions reductions. There's an important point here, is that as we try to find solutions to these problems, what we've tended to do is move the problem into a space where there are weaker and weaker feedbacks to us, economically, personally, those sorts of things, but there are not weaker feedbacks in the environment. And that's what we will continue to do if we don't see this as a total systems problem. With the other trade-off, which is food production versus biodiversity loss, in my time in Defra, I've seen a lot of people working really hard to solve the biodiversity loss problem. All the way from the whole of the IPBES activities, all the way down to people on specific tracts of lands trying to make a difference. It's all wonderful stuff, but we will just make that problem more and more difficult to solve unless we solve how we're producing our food, because food is what consumes land fundamentally. And I've already shown that our food production is extremely inefficient. So we need to transform our whole food production process. And the way I put it is that we need to transform our thinking from food production by agriculture to food production by manufacturing. Now, that in itself is quite a challenge to many people who like the idea that their food comes from an agricultural system and that sort of thing. But nevertheless, it is what we need to be able to do. We need to pare it back to its basic chemistry and then build it back up again. Now, what that will look like is anybody's guess, but there are lots and lots of things going on at the moment. There are lots of ideas around this. And what's more, I think the market can deliver on that if it's properly stimulated to do so, mainly because we all need to eat food. If we can produce it more efficiently, we can probably produce it more cheaply, and there's a lot of money to be made out of it. So that is something that I think is going to change, but again, government and policy needs to help make it happen. So we've got an arrow of progress here. We've got all these discourses competing with each other, and we've got a particular arrow of progress coming out of it. I think that if I was to measure the weighting between discourses, at least within governments at the moment, maybe not in the public mind, but certainly in governments, you'd see it more like this, that governments are really quite aligned to things like the survivalist discourse, sustainability, adaptation. They don't really much like the tragedy discourse, and that's not very uppermost in their minds. Why is the tragedy discourse so small? Well, it's partly because it requires a significant shift in behaviours. And to be frank, I think if I was a politician, I'd be looking at it thinking, oh, God, how do I implement something like that? That's really, really hard. I've already mentioned it needs demand-side policies. In other words, it needs politicians fundamentally to be saying to people, well, you want this, but sorry, you can't have it. And that's quite difficult for politicians. It's very easy for them to say, there's all these wonderful technologies that are going to give you all this great stuff, and I'm going to fund it. Thanks very much. You know, you see what I mean? It's actually very difficult to introduce demand-side policies, and really, you know, only by the public, people like us, giving permission to politicians to think in that way will it really ever happen. Now that doesn't mean to say it won't happen, but it's going to be difficult. So it requires fundamental economic reform, and in my view, it requires government and governance reform as well. Because in order to drive through that process, we would need a very determined government with a structure that actually made that happen, and that's probably going to be quite different from historic structures. So I'm just coming to the end here. So I'm doing okay?
Slightly over time.
Oh, sorry. Well, I'm just coming to the end. So here's what I would describe as the real current situation that we sit in. So this is me trying to reflect to you what I saw from within government. What I've done is I've pulled out a report which was produced, I think, last year by MOD. It's Global Strategic Trends report. The US military produces something similar, and I'm sure other defense organizations around the world do the same sort of thing. But if you read that, the environment is really important in there. They recognize it as being really important. It's about a third of all the big problems that they're looking at. So there's a major input from the environment to these global strategic trends. There's also, you know, a huge amount of geopolitics coming into this as well. But what we know is that there's a loop between environment and geopolitics as well, and that's where it gets a bit soft at the edges. And I think we need to be able to define how environment fits into geopolitics. There's some research on it, but not as much as I think we probably need. But what does this do? You know, if a government is faced with these global strategic trends, it's not able to look, you know, hugely long ahead. You know, what does it invest in? Well, it invests in its national imperatives, which is sustain economic growth and competitiveness. So that's, you know, let's invest in research. Let's put 2.4% GDP into research, but let's make it so that we're as competitive as the Germans and the Americans and the Chinese, etc. Rather than saying, actually, we need to put it in there because actually we've got to come up with some real solutions to some of the problems we've got. So it starts to push the narrative in a particular direction. And unfortunately, you end up investing in defense because actually you've got access to the resources. We're a wealthy country. We're in that space where we're all consuming more than our fair share of resources. So what do? As a responsible government, you defend yourself against that. So you invest in defense. And essentially that is really what's happening. That has a negative feedback on the environment. So we're doing things down here that may be on the surface environmentally conscious, but underneath they're not really doing much to drive the changes we need in the environment. What we need to do in government is try to manage these feedbacks. So this is the reality we're genuinely faced with. I'd love it to be different from this, but that is the reality. And so we need to try and measure, try and change this to some extent by measuring changing that negative feedback. Broader measures of success than GDP, I mentioned that earlier on. We've talked about in the past, the big we have talked about natural capital, how that can be used. But there are other things that we need to factor into that as well. And in my view, we need a machinery of government change in order to be able to make sure that the environment actually pops up in people's minds right across government the whole time. That includes the political class and the civil service as well. So just to summarize, resource consumption is rising and pretty much out of control. I think it's fair to say it's out of control. Nobody controls it. Nobody, or very few people even recognize it as being the problem. It's a driver behind waste and pollution, including greenhouse gases. There are some competing discourses. You may agree with them, you may not agree with them, but they may talk the talk, but not all of them walk the walk by a long way. We need social and structural reform in order to be able to deal with some of this. And government needs to appreciate this and to lead. And when I say lead, it's about machinery of government. It's also about political will to do that. And unless we solve those problems, I think we're going to have some really big problems by the time we get to 2050, even if we get to net zero carbon. And I'm not going to read this to you, but it's just a quotation. I'm not religious, I'm not a Catholic, but this is Pope Francis, and I think I broadly agree with him. Thank you very much.
So, I think you'll all agree that was extremely thought-provoking. I'm not sure there are any economists in the audience, but I think if there were, some of them might be bouncing around like little dynamos. So what we're going to do is throw it open to you. Hopefully we've got some questions. If not, I will start doing that. I think we've got microphones. So let's take, got some questions, brilliant. Let's take a crop of 3 because we're slightly over time. I think Ian's speech is a bit of a metaphor for a bit of resource overconsumption using time. And I was too riveted to notice, so that was a bit dopey. I'm a bit of a metaphor for governments here, just sitting and enjoying it. So let's go straight away. Let's have some questions and tell us who you are as well.
Okay, thank you. Kevin Collins, Open University. Very quick comment. There weren't environmental challenges, there were social challenges. Every challenge you named was a social challenge, not environmental. But that's a comment. The question is, all of the things you've talked about are relevant, but the one thing we're missing is any discussion about our skills and capabilities for systems thinking. At the Open University, we've taught for 40 years systems thinking and systems practice, and every time we talk to government, we realise that simply doesn't exist in government decision-making circles, the capacity for systemic thinking.
Okay, that's great. I'm going to keep the questions quite short, so if that's okay, and we'll come down here, and then we'll come here. We'll do a crop of 3, and then we'll move on. Yes.
Hello, I'm Dr. Marianne Brett. Outside of work, I partake in a group called Scientists for Extinction Rebellion. We've recently had our declaration in support of non-violent direct action signed by more than 1,500 scientists around the world. So my question to you is, in your view, how can movements like Extinction Rebellion and Ende Gelände in Germany successfully push politics towards the tragedy discourse?
Towards the tragedy discourse?
Tragedy discourse, yeah.
Okay, and then just behind you.
Hi, Mark Everard, University West of England. Your framing of resources was one of sort of fairly provisioning service, physical asset. I would reframe resources as living things, ecosystems which are inherently renewable. In my time in Defra, around 2011, both NEAs and the natural choice, we were optimistic of bringing that sense of ecosystem process across government department in urban planning. So ecosystem process would work there for flooding, for water quality, for so forth. I'm glad you put up global strategic trends. There are 228 mentions of water in the 2018. So the MOD in some ways have got the centrality of ecosystem process far more than other government departments. How do we bring that living sense of ecosystems across policy areas?
Okay, so Ian, let's take those questions. So is government hopeless at systems thinking? Is that your experience? We had that challenge over there that governments can't think about systems.
I think I would generally, I would dispute the fact that government doesn't recognise the need for systems thinking. Certainly, it was a term I used an immense amount as a chief scientific advisor, I think that what government doesn't quite know about is how to turn that into reality. You know, the civil service in particular is incredibly open to ideas and really wants to reform itself in many ways, but wants to pick up these ideas. And if there was a way of systematizing systems thinking within a civil service context, I think they would be all ears about that. And it does come back to my point about the machinery of government. You know, I think a fair question to me would be, well, what does that really look like? And actually, I'm not sure I know what it looks like, because it's a systems problem, and we haven't really got there with it yet. So there's a challenge back out to the academic community. I mean, I think also on your point about social challenge, you're absolutely correct. You know, I would have said that, that in my career, I've spent a lot of time being a natural scientist, and I've actually become a social scientist, because actually all the problems are human generated, to be quite frank. So I would say that I would defend myself in that sense, that the environmental challenges are really social challenges themselves.
So you dangled the idea of governance reform as being sort of one of the critical things, which might go partly to answer this question about sort of systems thinking. So actually, you know, people don't like Johnson or Corbyn tonight and say, let's actually, that Ian Boyd, he sounds like he's got some better ideas. Let's make him Prime Minister.
My God. No.
How do you reorganise government to sort of start tackling some of these things? I mean, how would you change it? Is it just a question of getting everybody to sign up to environmental limits, or what is it?
Well, I don't know. I've already said I have not thought this through myself. All I'm saying is that I think the current government structure doesn't really deliver what we need in the long term, or won't deliver what we need in the long term. You know, I think government, when it was faced with Brexit, did something very bold, and it created a Brexit department that would try to help deliver on Brexit. Whether it's well, it hasn't done that yet, but so it's probably not a really good example. However, you know, I don't think it's good enough just to say to all government departments with all their various different responsibilities, well, by the way, just do environment, you know, in everything you do. You could do that, but you need somebody, a fixer, looking in to make sure they're actually doing it, because otherwise they won't. Now, I'm not quite sure you structure that, whether you create an equivalent of the Cabinet Office that sits at the centre of government that's saying, actually, you're not doing a good enough job, and they're held to account on it. Parliament should really do it through the Climate Change Act, and through, hopefully, what will be a wonderful new piece of legislation on the environment. But nevertheless, I'm not convinced that even Parliament has that push to make it happen.
So do we need to change, let's take the question here, do we need to change the discourse? How do we change it to be a tragedy discourse? I'm actually quite interested in the audience. So how many of you would put yourself in the tragedy discourse? How many of you would put yourself in the adaptation discourse? All right. And how many of you are in the, I thought slightly unfair to, but anyway, sustainability, we might call have it all discourse, I think, sustainability. Okay, yeah, that's quite interesting, quite interesting. We have quite a sort of tragedarian
That's really
audience.
helpful, because that's the first time I've ever had that kind of measured against an audience view.
All right.
And it's interesting that we don't get just all going for one of them, because only one of them makes sense. They all seem to make some sense to people, which is very valuable, actually. It's good, interesting feedback.
So what do we do to actually get the sort of tragedy discourse off the streets, in a sense that Extinction Rebellion was doing, and into more of the political mainstream?
Well, I mean, I think it suffers because of the massive challenge that it puts in front of people. And so, you know, I think the best way to deal with that is probably, rather than, you know, protesting in the streets, although I don't think protesting in the streets is necessarily a bad thing to do, is to step back from it and try to analyse, well, what do we need to do in step-by-step, mechanistically, to work our way through these big problems. That's where I think Extinction Rebellion and those who push for climate change need to go with it. It's about, again, it comes back to the point about you can say that to a government, but actually a government needs to be able to enact it. It needs to systematize it. It needs to mechanize it. And helping them through that problem is really, really important, rather than just saying, there's a problem, over to you, you solve it.
But do you think Extinction Rebellion has sort of moved the dial on the political space to act?
I don't know. I think only time will tell. It could be a flash in the pan. On the other hand, it could have moved the dial, but I don't know.
Okay, yes, and the question here about did you focus too much, I think, on inevitably constrained physical resources and focus not enough on living ecosystems and the sort of
So I think that's a very fair criticism. And if I was to redo this, I would probably build that into it. So I think that's very useful. I would say, however, that I think that most of the living resource problems derive from our overall consumption. And it's consumption of land, it's consumption of resources overall, because actually that's what's driving the whole process of ultimately pollution at the end of the day, and that's what's degrading our living resources. Yes, we can manage our living resources to be able to counteract some of that to some extent, but with the direction of travel of consumption, I just think we're going to overwhelm the living resource capacity to absorb the impacts that's going to create. So that's slightly defensive, but at the same time, I think it's a good point.
Okay, let's go to some more questions. Got some more people. Where's the mic gone? We're going to come here to the front and then to the lady there, and then we're going to come to Adam for some of our Twitter questions. Yes.
Hello, my name's James Camp. You said we need another measure for our state rather than GDP growth. I just wondered if you had any ideas what that might be. I know David Cameron's government brought in the happiness index.
Yeah.
David Cameron probably rates very highly on it.
It's bizarrely held up very well. Yes.
I once had somebody say to me, it was a pastor, a Baptist minister in Ghana, how dare you advocate for not investing in fossil fuels? That is what members of my congregation use to pay school fees and lift themselves out of poverty. How do you square up everything that needs to be done without actually screwing people over?
Okay, that's a very good challenge there. Let's go to Adam for. You've got 3 questions. Okay, let's take one from a real person, and then we'll go virtually. Only slightly slagging off. Let's run over there. Into the far corner. People in the far corner have rights too. Yes.
So Anne Velentov, University of Leeds. So my question actually quite ties into the one about alternatives to GDP, really. So we know that the green growth narrative is kind of dead. It's not going to work. The alternative, degrowth, probably not going to go down very well with any government. I don't think that any political party would, who wants to lead would dare to promote degrowth. So my question is, what is the alternative? What is the alternative sort of political economic model that you think would be acceptable and would actually help to solve our issues?
So Ian, you don't like GDP.
Yeah.
I'm slightly dubious that governments really are always GDP maximised. Quite a lot of things they could do and add to GDP if they really, really wanted to. But what's your alternative?
So frankly, I actually don't have one. I'm a bit, doing what I say we shouldn't do and saying, well, there's a problem here over the wall. It's your problem, So it is a difficult one. I mean, I think the happiness index is helpful. you know, my approach to something like this would be to get a group of economists, natural scientists, and social scientists together to really work this one through, because I think that we could come up with something a lot better. But you know, the UK essentially was the source of GDP as a concept, and it's been taken up globally. It's a post-Second World War concept that we built. I think that we could build something different, but it would include all the factors we have in GDP at the moment, but it would be a multi-dimensional index. Now, you know, what does that mean? Well, it means that, you know, you have GDP along one axis, you have happiness along another axis, you have natural capital along another axis, you have air quality up another axis, or some other indicator, and I'm guessing here. But, you know, I think that if you have these clear, measurable criteria, something like the Office of National Statistics can turn that into an index that says, how are we doing? You know, that's the measure.
So you could add sort of natural resource use and depreciation,
Yep.
and use that as a negative in GDP,
kind of, yep.
which will give you a sort of better measure. And when I was Director of Sustainable Development at Defra, she says, admitting this, we published our Sustainable Development Indicators, and we had, I think, 161 indicators, but I was never convinced that putting them into a basket index would help, because they weren't really that tradable, and they were measuring sort of, you know, worked at different levels. Yeah. So you get the sort of dashboardy approach. I
think there are certain criteria you'd want to have for some form of index, and tradability might be one of them. But believability, you know, they've got to be socially acceptable, all those sorts of things. But I don't have the answer to that. All I know is that I think that us building our measures of success out of quite a narrow index, which is purely built on GDP, it worked probably during the second half of the 20th century. I'm not sure it's fit for purpose for the 21st century.
Let's just go to the question now. There's a real confrontation. You have, you know, Ghana, a real trade-off between access to cheap and reliable energy, massively important for development, and, you know, wider goals or whatever. And, you know, are we in any sort of position to preach, to say whatever? Yeah. Presumably on your Adair Turner graph, we're letting Ghana
I think
fossil fuels.
Yeah, you know, it's the same question as, you know, if I buy peas from Tesco's or something like that, you know, the peas may well have been grown in Kenya. You know, so do I buy peas from Kenya because actually that's helping the economy of a developing country, or do I buy peas that are grown closer to home, and am I willing to pay the carbon costs for you know, transporting it to this country? You know, I think there are issues around social responsibility here. There are issues around economic growth and development where we do need to make choices that are shifting the onus, if you like, onto those who are in charge of economic development to make sure that there are not major disadvantages sitting there. So, you know, I think your point is absolutely right that we will always have some use for fossil fuels. It may not be to burn them in the internal combustion engine, but we will always have use for fossil fuels. So why can't we take them from countries that actually can really benefit from the economic development? So that's the kind of sort of geopolitical decision that has to be made. But it's a tough one because that's not a free market.
Okay, we're going to go and hear some Twitter questions.
Okay, all three questions about food. First one is where the shift from agriculture to manufacturing has taken place. It tends to be quite unpopular. The kind of factory farms, Frankenstein, lab-grown food, and comes with its own set of environmental impacts, odour from factory farms, slurry lakes, etc. Are those problems insurmountable? And that's the first question. The second question is about what would you do with the land after it ceased to be agricultural? Is rewilding one of the options? And then finally, the agricultural bill is a once-in-a-generation opportunity to reform the agricultural sector. It's likely to come back to the House of Commons in the next Parliament. Can you talk maybe, and Joe, you might want to come in on this as well, about the context in which that's going to be drafted, whether it will really be drafted around domestic concerns or whether it will be kind of ping-ponging between whatever free trade agreement is being negotiated at the time?
So let's take the first two, then we can have a chat about the agriculture bill. So intensification, I think is really the question, isn't it? I mean,
Yeah.
we can get more out of the land if we basically farm in a very nasty sort of way.
So it depends on your definition of nasty. I mean, I think that from my experience, agricultural intensification done well is really good. You know, it takes into account the environmental impacts. It doesn't just account for them, it minimizes those environmental impacts. And that's about using knowledge and technology that we have available to us now in an intelligent systems thinking context. And there are actually farm businesses around, big farm businesses that do that now. They're not incentivized as much as they should be by regulation to push that kind of design. But I think overall, those farms that have least environmental impact are some of the biggest, most heavily invested farms, and those that have most are the smallest and least invested.
So you
farms.
don't accept that trade-off that
So I don't think
the questioner on Twitter
so there isn't a trade-off. I think there is some intensification has happened in the past that is really bad. There's no doubt about that at all. But it's been done with the best of intentions under an agricultural support system that has simply incentivized production. If you incentivize not just production, but environmental compliance and reduced environmental impacts, you will get what you incentivize. And I think that is perfectly possible.
So I'm going to now steer around. So, Ian, you were there when Defra was drafting the agriculture bill, which indeed was introduced actually quite some time ago before it went into cold storage because of all the amendments to the agriculture bill the government didn't want to have to debate. So do you think that the scheme that Michael Gove put into the agriculture bill of payments for public goods would deliver that sort of farming as opposed to the CAP?
I think the agricultural bill as a framework talking about public goods definitely has the potential to do that. The problem is implementation and what becomes defined as the public good at the end of the day. I think public goods is one of these terms that is very ill-defined, and I think you would probably get a different definition from whoever you speak to about it. And it's one of these wonderful things that is highly ambiguous, and so therefore any politician can stand up and say, yes, I support the idea.
So should we let the Office for Environmental Protection define public goods?
So I think that might well be a way of doing it, but I mean I wouldn't like to be prescriptive about it, but I think that if we define public goods by the political spectrum of the day, the dominant political spectrum of the day, then it will simply swish around between one thing and another, and it won't provide anything that is particularly long-term and robust. So we do need to provide robust definitions of what a public good is. And from my point of view, I think it's pretty narrow, actually. There are certain things that would sit within it and certain things that wouldn't. And pretty much everything that farmers do now would probably not sit within it.
So how do you feel about rewilding as a potential use for released land as we use farmland more efficiently?
I don't like the term rewilding because it kind of grossly simplifies what is a very important optimization problem about how we use our landscape. Landscape has many functions, but broadly we can use landscape for producing food, We can use it for health and welfare because there's recreation and all the other things that go with it. And we know that green space is really important to health and welfare. We can use it for sustaining biodiversity and ecosystem services. And we can use it, let's say, for carbon storage as part of the ecosystem services. But they're broadly the kind of functions that we have. And different land can serve those functions in different sorts of ways. And we've got to get much better at making decisions about how we incentivize the use of different lands for those different functions. And certain of those types of functions are public goods, there's no doubt about it, and those people who look after that land and deliver those public goods need to be paid appropriately for delivering those public goods from public funding. And that is where I think that we need to go with it. Personally, I think that's where Michael Gove intended it in the past tense, it to go. The problem is, and you know very well, that the political process can send these things off in odd directions if we're not careful.
Okay, we're running sort of towards the end, so if you've got a question, pop up now or miss out. Yes, we'll go there.
Hello, Ian Byrne. I'm council member of IAS and have been working in sustainable energy for something like 30 years. And my question is really about no regrets and how you actually persuade the public to take action without necessarily being wholly on the tragedy side of it. We have to reduce demands. We have to persuade people sometimes that less is more. And how can we do that?
Okay, good question. And let's keep the questions quite short. If we could have the mic coming here and then you can take the other mic there. Yep, mic in the front row. Front row. Front row. Man with hand up in the front row. Yep, and then there. Yeah. Yes.
Hi, Ab Katra from the Carbon Trust. I've got a very specific question, and I hope I'm not being too pedantic, but in one of the slides, you had 3 books, and one of your criticisms was that they don't recognize environmental limits. However, one of them, Donut Economics, the whole premise of it is living within planetary boundaries and that balanced space between social... Yeah. And my other question would be, what books would you actually recommend for us to read?
It's 2005 UK Sustainable Development Strategy. Yeah.
Fred Stewart, Imperial College. I like your discourse approach, but I think you're being a bit harsh on sustainability as a third discourse. UK did develop a sustainability strategy in 2005, Securing Our Future. I knew Jill would respond. It recognised environmental limits and it sought to transform a discussion about environmental problems into sustainable development solutions. Seems to me it was quite important. And it addressed one of your conclusions about changing the structure of government. It saw it as delivered by a partnership between a new central agency, Sustainable Development Commission, in partnership with Defra. SDC has been abolished and Defra has retreated from that role. So basically, haven't we actually gone backwards and created a gap as far as structural reform in government is concerned?
So can I just say, I didn't bribe that question, but it's a very good question. Anyway, final, I think somebody had a hand up over, oh, we've got 2 more. So yes, just in front, and then you just go right to the back. If you've got your hand up right at the back, then take, yeah.
Hi, Csaba Feldesi from University of Glasgow. And the question is, when we reach that tipping point, when we run out of resources, do you think that people will actually get together to solve the problem, or do you think we'll all descend to war?
Okay, that's a bit of a gloomy point, so we won't make you the last question. Yes, last question.
Hello, Stephen Inch from the Greater London Authority. So this is a question about governance, really, and the whole systems thinking thing. I think from the perspective of someone working in city-level government, we see at smaller levels, systems thinking is actually easier to do and feels successful at the city and the local and the communal levels. But in the analysis of it as a fundamental resource constraint problem, is that enough? Is that a useful model to the kind of big, broad problem as you've described it? Or are we just wasting our time?
Okay, well, let's combine, thank you very much. Let's combine questions 1 and 3 and say, actually, can we persuade people to take action before we get to a tipping point where we're really confronted with the consequences of having failed to curtail our things. So actually, how do you actually persuade people that there is, you know, political mileage, it's not a political death sentence in a democracy to take the sort of measures beyond no regrets?
Yeah, it's sort of difficult because, but I think, to be frank, I think people need to be confronted with reality, and the reality that actually in a reasonable time period, this might actually, if I don't respond to this, might actually cost me something. And I don't mean just money there. I mean sort of this is a kind of social cost as well as a kind of financial cost. So I think that and actually this plays to some extent to the tipping points question as well, is that as we, and I think this is already happening, by the way, as we run up towards resource constraints, we will continue to find ways of innovating our way out of those resource constraints, but we will have peaks every so often where we have problems that come about, and was it 2008 global food price spike is a kind of example of that. That was an extreme problem, but I think that those kinds of problems will build up. There are actually parallels here with natural ecosystems, which are simply just complex interconnected processes like we have in our own economies. And those ecosystems, when they go through a system change, what's called a bifurcation, before they get to that, there are telltale signs that they're going to break down and change. And I think that we may see some of these within our own system. And it's possible that the feedbacks from them might be strong enough to make people think again about how they live their lives and what they do. But they're going to have to be pretty strong, I think. The other side of this, of course, is leadership. And it's about governments being able to understand through the kind of advice we get from people like me and people in this room, that actually we need to lay the paths where people want to walk, but actually those paths have to lead them in the right sort of directions. And that's about informed policy making. It's about really being very imaginative about the kind of policies that we might have. I don't want to really talk about Brexit here, but there are opportunities with respect to the new legislation that is being proposed for the UK to do something really very imaginative. And I hope it does. I hope it makes use of that opportunity. I think there are huge dangers that it won't take that opportunity up. But it's about informed policy making as well. Sorry.
And what about the point about, haven't we really gone backwards? I mean, in 2005, we inserted living within environmental limits, one of the 5 SD principles. We thought that was quite a big advance to try and get the limits word in there. The government's not published a new sustainable development strategy since 2005, not perhaps just because it was the best ever, you could never do about one, or whatever, but, has actually that sort of gone backwards in the idea of the SDC as watchdog?
I think in politics the pendulum swings, and I think that a lot was done. I think that there's probably a kind of a sense that the box ticked and we can move on and it'll look after itself, and it probably didn't look after itself. I also want to just make sure that I kind of defend myself slightly. When I'm talking about environmental limits, I'm really talking about this resource consumption curve, which actually we're not recognizing, and it is a limit. Have we gone backwards? Well, actually, somebody sent me something from the early 1990s that could have been written in the present day with respect to the challenges that we have. The reality is that we're not moving on very quickly, is the way I would put it. We're recognizing the problem, but we're not being able to, again, systematize the solutions. And that's the big problem that we face. I think everybody recognizes there are problems to solve, but we're not.
What about the final point from our colleague from the GLA, that actually the UK is hopelessly over-centralised. We try and do everything at national government level. And actually the real progress can be made by the people who actually are of a scale where they can think systemically much more easily than we can in inevitably siloed central government. At local government, we actually ought to just back off a bit and challenge. There used to be loads of action around Agenda 21, local Agenda 21s, stuff like that. Should we just leave it to much more empowered local government?
So I think it's a really good point, and scale really does make a difference here. You know, when we're talking about systems thinking, we really should be talking about you know, different scales within systems, nested systems, and I think we have a structure through local government and then national government and then multinational agreements to be able to make these things work at all those scales. But each part of that system needs to understand what its role is, and you know, because we need a global response to this. But you know, even at a national level, if we need a national response, we need national strategy, and all those local governments that have to are really they need to be empowered to implement that national strategy, so that we're all marching in the same direction, but we're not at the central level telling every local government what to do in order to achieve a particular objective, because actually that's they know their business better than we do. So you know, I do think that the government structure is there to make this happen, but we're not probably using it as well as we should.
Okay, we're going to close it there because we are sort of running slightly over time, but thank you all very much for all your fantastically brilliant questions. Hopefully we came out, even though so many of you were brought into the tragedy analysis, that there are opportunities and possibilities, at least here, particularly if we actually get people taking the sort of diagnosis of the problem seriously. Before we go to have drinks next door, could you just all thank our very excellent Burntwood lecturer, Sir Ian Boyd.